Greetings, everyone, and welcome to week 2 of your Vertical Facilitator warm-up. This week, the topic is the personal leadership context. The main questions that we will examine in this video is what manner of personal leadership does the activity of vertical facilitation call for? In other words, how do we need to be and how do we need to show up? So, as we'll see, and as probably many, maybe all of you already have intimated, that this is ultimately about our own inner development. To the degree that we show up, that we can be present, that we can be aware, will determine our capacity to ultimately to catalyze transformation in others. In other words, you could say that to the degree that we can transform ourselves, we render ourselves a vehicle for the transformation of others. So ultimately, our capacity for being present and aware is the ultimate super skill of vertical facilitation. So let's start at the beginning, and we're going to do a little bit of review here for those of you who watched and worked with the materials from week 1. It all starts with sensing. So this is as true of life in general, certainly as it is in our work with groups and teams. And for the most part, what we're doing is we're just simply sensing and we're staying aware and present and sensing. And then at some point, we feel an urge and we might act on that urge. We might not act on that urge, depending on the nature of that urge. Ultimately, that urge is something that may either be a product of our own triggers and blind spots, or it could be a product of our awareness and presence. And to the degree that it's a product of the latter, our actions are going to naturally be congruent with what's going on. So we feel an urge, we act, and then we move right back to sensing. What was the impact of that? What's happening now? And much of what we're doing at any given moment is we're sensing, sensing, sensing. So there are two, well, actually, so really, ultimately, what are we paying attention to? And this goes back to the 5 windows of attention that we covered last week. The first of which is individuals. By the way, we're not going to go into detail at this point. We're just going to mention them. The first of them is individuals. What's happening with individuals? So we want to be paying attention to individuals within the team or group that we're working with. What's the nature of the interrelations between people? What's the nature of the conversation, the dialogue, the communication, how people relate with one another? So these are sort of almost somewhat transactional aspects of what's going on in groups and teams. What's the nature of the field? What does it feel like to be in this group? What's the vibe? What's the overall quality of energy? What's the emotional quality that's present in this group as a whole? So we're not looking at the particular interactions. We're just getting a sense of what's present here as a field. We're also being attentive to the content. So as vertical facilitators, typically there's some degree of content that we're working with, whether or not we are facilitating some sort of activity with a leadership team or we're leading some sort of workshop. There's always some content that we're dealing with. And so we're paying attention to that content and how it's landing and what's arising with people in relation to that content. And finally, we're being attentive to what's going on, you could say, in ourselves, or what's in our own space. How are we showing up? How are we being? So these are 5 windows that we're paying attention to. I keep using the word attention. It's a little bit more than just attention. So this capacity for vertical facilitation in relation to these 5 windows Underlying all of that are two kind of meta skills or two super skills, if you will. And one of them is the capacity for awareness. And the second is the capacity for presence. And so I want to unpack each of these. So we're going to start with awareness. And so awareness, you could say, is kind of like, you've probably heard me say this before, it's like the aperture of a camera. As you widen the aperture of the camera, apparently it allows more light into the lens. And as we broaden, as we widen our capacity for awareness, it allows in more and more of what's happening around us. By the way, awareness isn't just sensorial awareness. It's also awareness of sort of the complexity of sense making. Like what is it that I need to be able to understand? What's the quality of and level of complexity that I need to be able to understand in this moment? So all of that constitutes together a sort of deep, multidimensional kind of awareness. And so this is really what I mean by awareness. Now, the challenge or the problem here is that oftentimes our awareness gets constricted, it gets contracted. There are forces at work that contract our awareness, um, that render our ability to pay attention, it weakens it, it diminishes it. And to the degree we're not able to pay attention, we're not going to be effective at all in the kinds of moves we want to be able to make as vertical facilitators. So this question, what is it that brings about the contracting of our awareness, is a really important question for us as vertical developers and I'm sorry, vertical facilitators. And it points ultimately to our inner development. We'll come to that in just a moment. So what are these forces? I'd like to suggest that there are essentially two main forces at work. And the first of these are emotional triggers. And typically, these triggers are of the form of our fears and our anxieties. So something happens, somebody says something, somebody does something, some event occurs. Maybe there's an ongoing situation or a circumstance which serves to trigger us. And that's one of those triggers are one of the things that has the effect of contracting our awareness. We get focused on, we go inward and we're not able to pay attention to the bigger picture. The other thing that contributes to another force that contracts our awareness are simply our blind spots. It may not have anything to do necessarily with triggers, but they're just things that we just don't notice for whatever reason. Oftentimes we have cultural blind spots. Sometimes we have gender blind spots. There's many, many different factors that contribute to the blind spots that we have. But needless to say, we all have our blind spots, things that we just don't see. Okay, so I want to get us to something deeper here. Uh, I have found it to be very difficult to be able to intervene at the level of triggers and blind spots. We want to have some point of access. So, because ultimately we want to be able to transmute things such that we are less at the effect of these triggers and blind spots. So I want to propose that we get at something deeper, the deeper underlying operating system kernel, which in the world of human development is referred to as meaning making. And meaning making is just simply the inner mental processing by which uh, otherwise confused information coming from both within and without gets organized into categories that we can make sense of, and then on the basis of which we can form coherent theories of action and then actually take those actions. And so now that meaning making happens literally in millisecond timing, and for the most part, we're not aware of its machinations. We're not aware of its activity, and yet that activity literally determines our experience. It's the underlying mechanism that that arises along with these triggers and that comes along with and contributes to our blind spots. Now, the thing we want to be really clear about here is that meaning making, again, is an autonomic activity, one of which we are, for the most part, unaware. And to the degree that we are aware of it, we are, for the most part, don't really have much volition. We don't have much say in it. You could say that we don't have meaning making, it has us. And so we want to look at what are sort of some of the constitutive expressions of meaning making. How does it make itself, um, uh, how does it enact itself in a sense in that underlying mental processing? Well, one of these is the beliefs, and these are not beliefs that we consciously hold. So for instance, I might say that I truly believe in honest and open communication. However, when things get hot, when I'm in, those meetings where the anxiety and fear is really high, I might be super triggered. And the belief that's enacted in those moments, the belief that gets triggered is that if I open my trap in this moment, if I say the wrong thing in this moment, I'm going to get into some kind of trouble. What kind of trouble is not necessarily known really, but we can just feel it. So meaning making operates in the territory of mostly of our feelings. And so there are the beliefs, and that's one way in which meaning making sort of exerts its activity. Another way in which meaning making expresses itself is in certain theories. There's certain theories about how people are, about how the world is. And it's a kind of an explanatory framework. And again, these are theories that have us, not ones that we have. They literally color how we perceive and understand people. There are the stories, and the stories are more elaborate narratives that sort of tell us how we got to where we are. So stories are typically relate to our own self-image, how we see ourselves. And they might be of the form of, I grew up in an abusive household, for instance, and having grown up in such a place, I realized that the best way to survive is just to stay quiet all the time and not say too much. And that becomes the story of my life. And that story unfolds itself in terms of the kinds of triggers that happen, the kinds of blind spots that I run into. And then finally, we have preferences, things that we um, like better or less than others. So there are certain kinds of people that we prefer to be around. There are certain kinds of experiences. And incidentally, it's like that kind of thing where you feel an instant repulsion to somebody or to something, or you feel an instant repulsion or maybe an instant attraction to certain kinds of people. And you may not even be able to quite explain it, or if you do, it's going to be the form of a story, and it won't necessarily account for the presence of those preferences. They're just simply there. So all of these constitute the underlying meaning making that is forms the background or and informs the nature of the triggers and blind spots that we are exposed to, and that have ultimately that sort of contracting effect on our ability to be aware and ultimately to be present. So we want to have a way to look at these. We want to have a way to reveal those underlying meaning making constructs, not necessarily to change them. We have found, and research has found, that oftentimes simply uncovering what's operating in the background, that meaning making structure in the background, repeatedly uncovering that, um, helps us to become immune to their effects. So we don't necessarily have to change them, but to the degree we are aware of them, we become much more choiceful in how we're going to operate in any given moment. Rather than us being run by them, we can actually make a choice as to how we're going to show up, how we're going to be in any given moment. So we've been talking at some length now about awareness, and now I want to switch over to presence. And as we do so, I want to suggest that to the degree that we've been able to become aware of the underlying meaning-making structures that constrain our awareness, so we allow ourselves to become more present. And what do I mean by presence? Well, presence is our capacity to allow the world in and for people to sort of feel us. So presence is sort of allowing the world in, but it's also projecting some sense, some quality of spirit, of energy, of attentiveness, of friendly um, um, uh, mm, regard, I guess you could say, right? So it's that by which um, something can happen around us. It's not just our actions that generate effects around us. It's how we show up, and presence relates to how we show up. And you could say there are, I'm going to propose three aspects or three elements of presence. And one of these is our capacity to receive, or our capacity to allow another person in. Oftentimes we have barriers and boundaries, and to the degree that we can really feel and really hear and listen to other people, and to receive even the energy that's present, like so for instance, the field energies, to the degree that we can receive anything in relation to those five windows is one aspect of the degree to which we are able to be present. Another aspect of our presence is our ability to hold. So we receive, to the degree we can receive what's happening, we can actually hold what's happening. Oftentimes, groups and individuals can become somewhat overcome by anxiety, by fear, by any manner of other sorts of things. And so, to the degree that we can allow that in, to receive it, and then to hold it, so that they don't have to hold it, so that it provides some degree of freedom. And maybe we can hold it, but then we can show it to them. And that allows some degree of for them to be aware. They can't be aware of that which is going on when they are, triggered by it. And so holding is, in a sense, our ability to kind of borrow their triggers and allow them to maybe experience something without the interference of being triggered by it. And then finally, it's our capacity to respond with empathy. Maybe sometimes we need to respond with some degree of forcefulness, right? So it's our ability to respond, you could say, appropriately, or said another way, to respond in ways that bring about the kinds of effects that might generate greater awareness, greater capability in the groups and teams that we're working with. Okay, so that's a bit on presence. Now we want to come back to, because we're going to move to an activity, because ultimately to develop our capacity for awareness and presence, we need to develop certain inner development practices ourselves. So vertical facilitation is in part about um, practices with which we work with groups and teams, but there are also practices with which we work with ourselves. And I want to introduce a kind of activity that can help us get at the underlying meaning making related to specifically to triggers. We're not going to do this thing with blind spots today, although this might also apply to blind spots. And here's the activity that I might suggest. And I actually suggest that you practice this maybe, for the next several days and see what happens. Okay, so here's the activity. You're going to want to pay attention to a fear or an anxiety that arises whenever you're with people, especially in a group situation where you have some kind of leadership role. So So that's the situation you want to pay attention to. And you might reflect on something that happened, a little while ago. It's less powerful unless the experience was super, super impactful. It's less powerful if it's something that happened many days ago or weeks ago. So that's the first part of this activity. The second part of the activity is to ask yourself the following question. So you're paying attention to some quality of fear or anxiety that arises in a particular moment, right? You might even be present with that. You ask yourself the question, it sounds like a strange question, what must be true for this feeling to be warranted? Okay, so there's going to be something that's true that warrants this particular feeling. Another way to get at this is that given this feeling of fear and anxiety, what's the underlying belief, theory, story, or preference that's either uh, asserted or counteracted by this feeling? But I find that the easiest way to get at this is what must be true for this feeling to be warranted. So that's the second part of the activity. So you want to reflect on that. It's a good idea to write these things down. You might write down many things until you land on something that feels um, authentic and real for you. It's got to be authentic. It may not be comfortable. So for instance, I I might be anxious about this video. I want this thing to communicate really, really well. And so if I ask myself the question, what must be true for this feeling to be warranted? What must be true is that um, I have to do things really, really well. I have a belief that I have to do things really, really well for people to appreciate what I'm doing. So then the next part of the activity, okay, so here's some examples. So that's the entire activity, actually, those two questions. And here's an example. Feeling anxiety in the face of confusion in the group. None of us have ever experienced that before. And so, what must be true when people are confused? It's my fault, and I should therefore fix it. Hence my anxiety and fear. So, this might seem kind of simple on the face of it, but I can pretty much promise you that if you practice this for a few days, something is going to shift. Some new kind of awareness is going to start to dawn on you. Now, the best way to get at this, or the best way to engage in this activity, is through a particular mode of dialogue with another person. You could do this sort of work by yourself, um, but I have found over the years that this works much better in working with other people. In fact, the very notion of working with other people in our own inner development is foundational to the work of the entire curriculum of vertical facilitation and all of the work that I do ultimately. So, but there's a particular mode of dialogue that you engage with another person. And in next week's live session, and in an introductory video that you'll watch either this week or next week, we'll introduce one such dialogical practice, which we call the deliberately developmental conversation. Some of you may have read about it or seen about it, but we're going to do a little bit of introductory work with that dialogical method. It's a very powerful way to do the kind of work that I just now described. So go out and practice as much as you can. That's where you will get the ultimate learning from this week, which is really about your own inner development. So thank you very much.